Rajendra Dengle, Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences and Head of Department of Foreign Languages, Professor Prasanta Kumar Das, and participants, friends. So on behalf of Department of Foreign Languages, I welcome you all to this special lecture titled Phenomenological Turn in Human Sciences, Foreign Language Teaching and Learning in India. And I would like to take this opportunity to share with you all that this is the first event organized by the Department of newly established Department of Foreign Languages, Tezpur University. So without further ado, now I would like to introduce today's distinguished speaker, our teacher, Professor Dr. Rajendra Dengle. So Professor Dengle has been awarded the PhD in 1990 by the Jain with the title Jordan von Horvath auf der Suche nach einer anderen Religiosität. Professor Dengle is working since August 1979 at the Center of German Studies, JNU. The main areas of teaching have been theories of literature, theory of the novel, history of literature, and in addition of being professor, he has been the Dean of Students of JNU as well. His area of interest and research have been literature of Hon'ble, philosophy of language, comparative study of German and Marathi literature, problems concerning literary translation, theories of the new media and literature. He has to his credit several research and translation projects and journal articles. Professor Dengle has translated a number of literary texts from Marathi and English into German and has jointly translated Nobel Prize winner Hetta Müller's novel from original German into Hindi. Sir also engages himself with artistic endeavors and he began learning to work with clay on wheel, and recently his artistic works have been also exhibited at Lalit Kala Academy and India Habitat Center, New Delhi. So thank you for being with us today, sir. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. And now I would like to request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Vinod Kumar Jain, sir, to inaugurate the event and chair the session.
Thank you, Dr. Pallavi. As you have just mentioned, that this is the first event being organized by the Department of Foreign Languages, which is the newly established department in Tezpur University. And as you know, and Professor Dengle has been also somewhat instrumental in encouraging us in establishing some new departments. But we in the administration are very keen to initiate some academic activities and expand on the academic programs in foreign languages. The title of the talk, which you have just mentioned, Pallavi, the Phenomenological Turn in Human Sciences. Well, given the creative talent of Professor Dengle, because when he was the Dean of the Students, I had the privilege of working with him as Associate Dean of Students for 3 years. And we have known each other for last 20 years or so. And it has been a real privilege and very enriching experience for me as an individual. So thank you, Professor Dengle, for agreeing to deliver this talk in the Department of Foreign Languages. You know, there couldn't be a better person to give a sort of honest appraisal of, you know, about the foreign languages departments in the country than Professor Dengle. Because some of us, we have a very, perhaps a very misplaced perception. It is to do with, you know, some of us, like, you know, a common man on the street would find that the language teaching learning is somewhat very glamorous. In fact, some people would say that these foreign language teachers do have kind of some attitude or something. But anyway, so there are different kinds of perceptions in the society. Nevertheless, the teaching learning in foreign languages is very important as far as the country as a whole is concerned, because you need specialists, you need experts who can contribute in terms of translation, and who can also help in getting an insight into the country of the origin of that particular language, the political system, the social system, the cultural aspects. And in the modern context, getting to know each other is so important in the geopolitical context also, apart from, of course, the obvious economic and trade dimensions. So it is in this respect that perhaps we have the most suitable person to talk about the teaching learning of foreign languages in our country. And I'm sure, knowing him, that he would give a very honest appraisal of the current status of teaching learning in foreign languages. So having said that, I'm looking forward to his talk, because what he's probably going to talk about is going to be based on his extensive experience, because as a student, as a faculty, and a much widely traveled person, he has actually lived the discipline of German language, and so his experience is something which he's probably going to share with us, and so I'm looking forward to his talk. And thank you, Professor Dengle, once again for agreeing to talk to us, and thank you, Pallavi, for giving me this opportunity to be part of this event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your kind words and for your support. Now I would like to invite Professor Prasanta Das, sir, to kindly take the charge as the moderator for this event, sir.
Thank you, Pallavi. Good morning, sir, Vice Chancellor Jain, and good morning, Professor Dengle. We were set up as a department, we were established in February, and the pandemic has disrupted our plans somewhat. But this is the first event, as Pallavi announced. And so without further ado, may I request Professor Dengle, a friend of the newly established department, to kindly give his talk. I see the participants have all muted themselves. We'll have an interactive session at the end. And you can also write any queries that you have in the chat box. So thank you. And now over to Professor Dengle.
Pallavi, how do we, just a question about the screen that we have. I mean, I see several windows here. So what is it that you want me to do?
Sir, you on the right hand side, there there is a small box. So there is a icon, pin yourself to the main screen.
Remove tile.
No, sir, pin yourself to the main screen.
The main screen. More options. No, because I see several windows here. What is it that you want me to do? Please tell me.
On your picture, sir, there is a icon. There is the pin icon.
Pin yourself to your main screen.
That's right.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Okay. Is that it?
Yeah.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Professor Jain, Vice Chancellor, Professor Das, Dean, and dear Dr. Pallavi, for your kind words of introduction and the invitation to deliver today's special lecture. It is indeed an honor to be with you to congratulate you not only on establishing the Department of Foreign Languages, but also for wanting to develop a vision for its future growth. I feel privileged to share with you some thoughts on how such a department could define its identity, the tasks, and the challenges which teachers and students of foreign languages face, and to reflect on a possible trajectory of its growth. Ladies and gentlemen, I remember a conversation I had with Professor Jain when he was the Vice Chancellor of Doon University on the possibility of engaging colleagues and students of the School of Languages there interactively with what one may call a philosophy of communication. Philosophy of communication by going into some aspects of the kind of impact Edmund Husserl's crisis of the European sciences has had on the understanding of human sciences. And I'm happy I can do a bit today, albeit under the so-called new normal conditions, though it was a pleasure to see some of you, for it would have been a different story altogether to meet you face to face on one of the most picturesque campuses I've ever visited in this country. What a strange situation this lockdown has been, hasn't it? Forced to live in a bubble, as it were. Just you and yourself. Watching the endless film on the screen of your mind when you tire of watching Netflix. And yet, learning to embrace the newness of this situation, the pause it has created. And one is reminded of the story of the Greek geographer Pausanias, who is credited with locating the spot where the two rivers, Lethe and Mnemosyne, the river of forgetting and the river of remembering, come so close that you cannot distinguish between the two. In a sense, the situation is ideal to explore the space prior to the cogito, to engage with the confessions of Augustine, his dialogue with himself, the realization of the temporal character of human existence, the nature of language, language in day-to-day communication, language in literature, and to engage with the profound reception that Augustine has inspired, be it Husserl, Heidegger, Gadamer, Buber, Flusser, or Ricoeur. And in spite of the situation, there seems to descend upon you a sense of relief and hope and optimism that a profound perspectival change may hold a promise of some new beginning. Now, as you know, it has been said that I teach, and I've been teaching at the School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies, a name that the school acquired a few years ago. Till then, it was simply School of Languages. And I was talking at the Dengle University a few months ago, and I've said it there about the task of the foreign language teacher. So some of you might have heard what I'm saying right now. So this change in the nomenclature, raised some serious issues and questions as to the identity and the tasks of a foreign language teacher then. The name of the school may suggest, as it must, it's a university school after all, and a university has to create separate disciplines and then take pride in its interdisciplinary approach to education. JNU has a different school called School of Arts and Aesthetics, and has announced a new School of Indian Classical Dance. So the name of my school may suggest that the three areas, language, literature, and culture, are somehow separate disciplines, different from each other, and yet somehow they belong together. One began to wonder whether one was a mere quote unquote teacher of a foreign language, or of translation, or of culture, civilization, social history, theory, or philosophy. Having taught and interacted for some years now with students at different levels of the various programs of study, trying to explore the possibilities of creating meaning together, intertextually, dialogically, trying to experience, to see the truth of one subject matter in terms of the other subject matter, and vice versa, one could perhaps describe the experience of a teacher of foreign languages in such a situation as liminoid. Somewhere along the way, it dawns on him that he has become a perhaps always was, a liminal person. To use the term of Victor Turner, as a threshold person. Liminality, stemming from the Latin limen, meaning a threshold, a concept used by the folklorist Arnold van Gennep, which Turner, the anthropologist, took up to describe modes of modern existence. Turner wrote The Forest of Symbols in 1967, which included the essay Betwixt and Between. I quote him, "Liminality served not only to identify the importance of in-between periods, but also to understand the human reactions to liminal experiences. The way liminality shaped personality, the sudden foregrounding of agency, and the sometimes dramatic tying together of thought and experience," unquote. The necessarily ambiguous nature of the liminal experience involves the temporary suspension of one's identity, causing confusion and disorientation, but if sustained with, always has the promise of perspectival change, or even transformation, or the possibility of becoming a different, a more aware human being. A perspectival change as a desired goal and effect of a language class can be a way out of the boredom in the language class, and can or should in fact begin as an early engagement with literary texts as part of language didactics, as Harald Weinrich strongly recommends. According to him, a conventional language class tends to design itself on the basis of a simplistic understanding of language. I think Professor Jain was alluding to that. The impression created thereby is as if the only meaningful way language can function is to be a means of day-to-day communication. Language understood this way appears as if it is a given. As if it is a given to the human subject, a system of rules, an instrument to be used in order to achieve a desired goal. Weinrich points out that Austin's famous question, how to do things with words, therefore gets reduced to how to do things. And language that is taught and learned ceases to be that which has the ability to inspire and encourage an understanding of the complex inner experiential world of feelings and emotions of two different human subjects when they talk to each other. Students of German literature may remember what Faust says, wie ein Geist zu einem anderen Geist spricht. Martin Buber the great philosopher of communication, with his understanding of the principle of dialogicity in life, reflects on whether the human subject of communication, the I, exists at all as such, or whether it exists in the dual mode of I-you and I-it. Whether the I who communicates with another I is aware that he has this choice, and also of the consequences of the choice he makes. Buber's philosophy of culture, his critique of the then existing culture on the verge of accepting fascism as a normal way of life, a philosophy of life which ignores or suppresses fear and alienation as facts, which justifies exploitation of the other and is obsessed with power, is based on his radical philosophy of language. We go back to Weinreich, and the difference between understanding language as a means and language as a medium of communication, for which he refers extensively to some of the reflections of the Russian formalists such as Viktor Shklovsky and Roman Jakobson. Shklovsky's theory of the prose, which some of you are familiar with, tries to go into the question of how literary art works. He defines the freedom of the language artist as the ability to liberate the word from the monotony of the stereotypical semantic groove in which it is trapped, to defamiliarize it with itself, and then to transfer it to another semantic groove in which it begins to mean differently. The question about the content of literature, what does literature say, shifts to how does literature say what it says. Word becomes metaphor and begins to tell different stories. What purpose does this production of art in language serve? Well, nothing that will fetch the recipient a job, for sure, but it can definitely encourage him to become aware of his own existential no exit kind of a situation. To speak in the sense of Sartre, or even in the sense of Plato's allegory of the cave, where somehow or the other one of the prisoners is liberated and then walks up and sees the sun as the true reality and comes back to tell his other fellow prisoners who have been taking these shadow plays on the wall as the only reality they know. I mean, one keeps coming back to Plato's allegory of the cave time and again. Does the creative writer therefore use alienation as the basic experience of man to alienate the word from itself? And does this semantic shift alienate the alienated reader from his alienation, is the question. Pandemic gives you enough opportunity to philosophize. So let's use that. It would indeed appear so, but all readers, everybody, probably not. It would seem as if it's only the initiates, the ones who have crossed the threshold of denial and have accepted that things are not what they appear to be, that they have been stuck in a web of prejudices, of conformism, people who are disconnected with and in their culture, those who have become attentive to the importance of participating in the act of experiencing, for it seems there is no other exit. Hermann Broch, the great Austrian writer and thinker, we have an expert of Hermann Broch sitting in our midst today. Hermann Broch calls the unreflected use of words kitsch. Adorno calls it jargon. Eugen von Horvath, the author I worked on, had the privilege to work on from the Weimar period, calls it a lie. Fritz Mautner writes a whole critique of language. Hugo von Hofmannsthal's Chandos stops writing as he finds that language has failed as a medium of communication, and Mautner's Buddha goes into silence. But Chandos begins to write again. After sharing his problem with his friend via a letter, Buddha begins to speak again after finding that Subhadra, a friend who understands his teaching of no self as love. And thus, in short, the journey of language as traced by some of the language philosophers begins with a pessimism as regards what the language has become, and skepticism as to what she can accomplish. It then enters into the crisis mode, and then language finds herself again, reborn, with a new trust in herself, a new confidence. The crisis is overcome, and with a renewed trust in her ability to connect with other human subjects and their inner worlds, creating a new human being and a changed perception of reality, leaving the world of entropy and creating a neg-entropic mode of IU communication with the other as self, the other as myself. To speak in the sense of Wilhelm Flusser, the great media theoretician whose family was annihilated in Auschwitz and migrated to Brazil and became a philosopher of communication at the University of Sao Paulo. And in this sense, Harald Weinrich suggests at the end of this chapter that cultivating an insight into the phenomenological hermeneutics of literary communication into an aesthetics of reception of everyday life should form an integral part of the didactic toolkit of a language teacher. An aesthetics of everyday life while teaching everyday language is for him the way out of the endless boredom of everyday life, as he quotes Goethe. His appeal to the language teacher is that he learn to see the life that surrounds him, his life world, Lebenswelt, with a sense of wonder. And what it is in literature that makes you see, what image are we talking about? Poetic image is the metaphor. It is the metaphor that needs to be interpreted, and seeing happens in the process of interpreting the metaphor. I'll talk a little bit about Ricoeur's understanding of metaphor. But prior to that, let me just say that in his seminal work, Time and Narrative, there is a fantastic reading of Augustine's Confessions, where Augustine is talking about a totally different sense of time. That time is something which is there in the objective world. It is not, the notion of eternity is not a temporal notion. Being is eternal. Time is something which you can observe. And his way is a way inward. And when that person who is seeking knowledge, true knowledge, turns inward, he can see time as part of the world out there. And so he realizes that this seeker of knowledge is somehow or the other trapped when he identifies with himself with this body, mind, and so on, that he's trapped in either the past or the future, which means either the regret for the things that I've done, or anxiety as to what is to come. And there is no exit, as Sartre says, in this. The only thing is to look upon yourself, to enter into a dialogue with yourself, as Augustine says, and find your true subjectivity. And that's the point that I'm making with this phenomenological turn, that it's all about finding the true subjectivity. And ironically, that subjectivity can be found only when you let the other recover the other's subjectivity, and this is, but again, pandemic, freedom to philosophize. So let me talk about Ricoeur a little bit and his, Ricoeur's concern in this text, the metaphor and the problem of hermeneutics, is twofold. Firstly, the status of the written text in opposition to spoken language, and secondly, the status of the movement from explanation to interpretation. And the task he sets up for himself is to find a common basis for a theory of the text and a theory of the metaphor. This basis he calls discourse. In the tradition of Schleiermacher and Dilthey, interpretation has a specific subjective connotation, for the subject of the reader is part of the process of understanding as well as of the reciprocal relationship between text interpretation and self-interpretation. This process has been described as the hermeneutic circle. Now, there is a critique of the hermeneutic circle that it actually is a vicious circle, that you actually don't end up having any meaning, and so on and so forth. And there again, I think the Ricoeur's reading of Augustine's Confessions, and actually imagining that Augustine is entering into a dialogue with Aristotle, to have a dialogue, a conversation between Aristotle's understanding of poetics and Augustine's Confessions, gives him the possibility of looking at emplotment, what he calls emplotment, to creating a story. You see, when I go through life, I don't have a story, but when you ask me, and this is what we were talking about in class just yesterday, and when you ask me to tell my life story to you, this is the first time that I put the three Aristotelian things, the unity of time, space, and that of action. I somehow bring them into a cohesive structure, and I said, that is what I am. That is my story. So creating a story with the help of these axes of time, space, and action, creating a plot. And where is this plot created? That is another wonderful thing. The plot is created in the cave, Plato's cave, where this freed prisoner comes back with a narrative and tells the other people who still are happy with their shackles, being shackled, So this is what, I think the space where this kind of a drama is enacted is absolutely wonderfully interpreted by Ricoeur in his engagement with Augustine. So he says that this hermeneutic circle need not be a vicious circle. It can be a very healthy circle, And so he then says, spoken language or speech displays a twofold referentiality. Firstly, while speaking, we seem to be referring to a reality which lies outside of language, say the world, and also to the inner reality of the speaker as someone who sees the world and refers to it as such. Seen this way, language and each unit of language, namely the sentence, has this double referentiality. It refers to a thing and it refers to the self. So event and meaning, individual identification and general predication, sense and meaning, the double referentiality of reality and self summarize the definition of discourse. Now, how does this work while dealing with the written texts? With literature, now we are in the classroom situation where I have understood this theory. Now, what do I do with the metaphor? Do I accept this metaphor, this understanding of metaphor again as an object of knowledge, which has again been given to me? If that happens, then I need to ask myself, do I use the understanding of the metaphor as the key to explaining this world of the text, whereby my world may not be necessarily affected in any way, so that I may begin to see it differently? This way, I, as teacher of the poetic image, may have succeeded in explaining the intentionality of the writer. I may have succeeded in explaining the technique, how a literary work of art has been produced, without letting my own guard down. As if what I'm teaching is about something. The teaching is for my students, not for me. Or do I use the understanding of the whole text as a key to understanding the metaphor, which would perhaps encourage a dynamic movement of understanding the world of the text and the expansion and deepening of my own experiential horizons, which would include an understanding of both the worlds, the world of the text and my own life world. Do I understand? So this is something to do with translation. In fact, William Flusser considers that his whole life, whatever he did, was a translational activity. He was born and brought up in Prague, which was a multicultural, multilingual kind of a society. I mean, Yiddish, German, he knew these languages, and he goes to Brazil, lives in exile there, and aspires to becoming a writer in Portuguese. And he could talk 4 languages. He could write equally proficiently in French, Portuguese, English, German. So this translational activity is something when my understanding and the object which has been given to me, there is an activity which is a translational activity also for Flusser. So do I understand and explain the metaphor as merely a play of substitution of one known horizon of meaning with another known horizon of meaning, translating the metaphor and the poetic image by paraphrasing or reducing it to the known? Here we cannot talk of creation of new meaning or of any change in the subject of knowledge in terms of his perception of his life world or himself. Or do I develop an understanding of the metaphor as a semantic invention and innovation? I'm sorry, it's not invention, innovation. Beg your pardon. The semantic innovation, that is the term that Ricoeur uses, this innovation comes actually from nowhere, has no known connotative or denotative status in the known system of language. Can the metaphor of the writer or poet become my metaphor, in the sense, my creation? In the sense, by asking such questions, Ricoeur takes Klauski's defamiliarization and semantic shift and complexity of form to another level of innovation, emphasizing and creating an opaque image. The whole movement is moving towards greater understanding of greater complexity of life. So the image is opaque. It is that the author does not make it transparent. He doesn't explain what he's trying to say. He wants you as a reader to take that journey yourself. So an opaque image which seems to hide more than it makes visible. And therefore that opaque image inspires the reader, observer, recipient to exercise his or her power of imagination evermore. Now I'm going to, as you might have seen, I'm looking at the growth of a department of foreign language, beginning with literature and a different understanding of language. And then I move on to a different turn, which is the pictorial turn or the iconic turn, because it's extremely important for us to come to terms with what the new media are actually doing with us, as foreign language learners and teachers. What happens to the text in the digital world, and so on. So the common thread which runs through these turns, to my mind, is the phenomenological turn. The problematizing of the subject and object of knowledge, as Buber said. Anyway, let me talk a little bit about Gottfried Böhm, who is said to have initiated the iconic turn in the 1990s, which was to overtake the already established linguistic turn initiated by Richard Rorty. In his seminal text, Die Wiederkehr der Bilder, The Return of the Images, Böhm discusses the complex tension between image and language, particularly in European modernity. His thesis is that, historically speaking, the growing interest in the image as oscillating between cultural figuration and agony of the real coincides with the growing uncertainty of the knowledge and truth claims of philosophy, and obviously with the evolution of modern art itself. Some of the philosophers who contributed to this shift from the belief in a strictly linear, logical, conceptual, naturalistic representation of reality, in German you have the term Wirklichkeitssinn, to a mode of the plausible, in German Möglichkeitssinn. According to Böhm, these philosophers are, among others, Kant, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Freud, Wittgenstein, Husserl, and Heidegger. The image, the power of imagination, the metaphor, the intuition, began to draw serious attention as sources of knowledge, as Hans Blumenberg in his Metaphorology was to proclaim that philosophical thinking, I quote him, philosophical thinking was duty-bound to be metaphorical, unquote. Metaphernpflichtig. What is a metaphor? What is an image? As artistic creations, they are not photocopies or reproductions of the so-called real. The great painter Paul Klee says, I quote Klee, art does not reproduce the visible. Art does not reproduce the visible, rather it makes visible, unquote. Kunst gibt nicht das Sichtbare wieder, sondern macht sichtbar. Art does not reproduce the visible, rather it makes visible. As foreign language teachers, learners, philologists, our basic triadic model remains speaker, speech act, listener or author, and text, reader. And the perennial task of the teacher remains that she develops this metaphorical competence, which is also the ability to read, to listen, and to see. While elaborating the phenomenon of seeing, Böhm goes into the history of seeing. He refers to Konrad Fiedler, the art theoretician of the 19th century, who thought it was his task to free the seeing from its passive role from within the philosophic endeavor to acquire knowledge and to describe it as an active and self-determining activity. Acknowledging the role of phenomenology of Husserl and his students like Fritz Kaufmann, Eugen Fink, Roman Ingarden, Böhm, while defining the eye as the window, moves on to discussing Merleau-Ponty's The Eye of the Spirit. What is important for our discussion in his thesis that to see is to be seen. The seeing body is simultaneously the visible body. It is a twofold seeing. Its dual belonging to the order of the objects as well as to the order of the subjects makes it a place of intersection where reality is construed. And this is the location of image or the metaphor. What connects the metaphor to the way images are structured? Böhm cites the wonderful verse from Rilke's second Douzaine elegy, Almost Deadly Birds of the Soul, to show, I quote, all efforts to normalize the metaphor, domesticize it, normalize the metaphor in language are destined to fail, unquote. It requires a special act of thinking, as Lukács in a different context would call it, or a different power of imagination, as Flusser would urge us to look at. The connect between the metaphor and the image is the difficulty to decipher either, which brings us to the role and the task of the recipient and the competence and his competence as producer of meaning. Böhm cites how Danto sees the power of the metaphor as a rhetorical figure of an incomplete conclusion. To be able to see images is to be aware of the resonances with the visual intersections, interactions, and serendipitous synthesis. These figures are called enthymemes. It's a wonderful word, enthymemes, which highlight the gaps in the regulated syllogism. And it is precisely the incompleteness, the openness, and polyvalence of their form which attracts and compels the reader to get involved. I'm slowly coming to the end of my presentation by talking about one other philosopher of liminality. I find him extraordinarily exciting because he's so important in today's world of migration. You know, many people are engaged in doing their research projects in the literature of the migrants, the post-memorial literature, and so on and so forth. Bernhard Waldenfels, I think, is an extraordinarily important philosopher of liminality. There is much that one can learn from his writings. In Ordnung des Sichtbaren, here only the connect with the visual and the written and so on. In Ordnungen des Sichtbaren, orders of the visible, while mulling over the puzzle of seeing, he quotes Merleau-Ponty, nothing is as difficult to know as what we really see, unquote. Is there therefore an unconscious seeing which does not know that it sees and what it sees, or is seeing only then real seeing when it transforms into a consciousness of seeing? It's a methodological shift. What we talked about earlier, you know, Shklowski and so on, this question of how, it's not just the act of seeing, but also simultaneously reflecting upon what is seeing itself, developing a consciousness of seeing. Also, while pointing out that there is a chasm between seeing and knowing, he takes the earlier Paul Klee quote further to both include the observer-reader and to draw attention to the importance of his or willingness or ability or competence to see. Quote, the artist obviously not only makes visible, but makes you see. But first and foremost, makes himself see. So the onus is on both the creator and the recipient and the created work of art. This seeing obviously involves a synthesis of what Waldenfels calls recognitive seeing. Recognitive seeing. And seeing. The first seeing is small, the next seeing is big, capital S. Seeing. Which does not take you to another world, but brings into effect a different perception of this very world. This, our world, appears as another world. No longer a world complete in itself, but as a world which is just about to emerge. In German, this beautiful term, im Entstehen sein, world about to emerge. This argument is similar to what Waldenfels has been talking about in the context of his phenomenology of the alien, namely a different experiencing of the world which involves both the self and the other, encouraged by two ways of process of communication involving pathos and response. Interpreting and understanding the metaphor as image, requires imagination. That's the last point that I'm making. There is nothing new in this statement. We know that while Descartes doubted, Giambattista Vico imagined, and that was the tension Renaissance. Wilhelm Flusser defines the power of imagination as a complex and intentional gesture with which man finds an orientation to understanding his life world. The gesture is a dual gesture. Again, we keep coming back to something, but in different contexts. Imagination that involves the creator of the image distantiating himself from the thing that he wants to create an image of, and imagination that involves the viewer or the reader of this image distantiating himself from the image, from the object, and also from the created image. This distantiating themselves from the object of knowledge or perception, or that which they want to understand, by either recreating it or by observing this recreation, involves, according to Flusser, of necessity, a turning inward, which is what Augustine said, that the true way to knowledge is the way inward. Turning to a location hitherto unknown to both the creator and the recipient. He calls it an Unort, a no place. Imagination, and this is not some sort of a new age philosophy or some blah blah. I mean, he knows what he's talking about. I mean, someone who has written a seminal book on photography knows what the medium of the camera does to the subject and object, and the whole business of creating in the medium. McLuhan medium is the message, and so on. So he calls that place an Unort, or no place. Imagination, this business of entering this strange unknown place where images are created and also their understanding happens, is also the place where subjectivity or existence is created. In the process of creating an image, the creator creates himself. In the process of understanding the image, the observer or the reader creates himself, understands himself. I quote, imagination is the most singular ability to retreat from the world of objects into one's own subjectivity, to become the subject of an object world, or it is the unique ability to exist rather than to insist. Die einzige Fähigkeit zu existieren anstatt zu insistieren. That's what in German. Turning inward to get out of your mind. That is something which Gadamer then uses, außer sich sein. To become aware of what is going on between your ears, in your mind, as a conditioned projection, as a text that is being constantly written, a text without the author, a film without the director, which is being constantly projected on the mental screen, a film without the director. The existence of the Holocaust is for Flusser apocalyptic. And the experience of Bodenlosigkeit, which means he has the sense of, I have absolutely no connect with my past. And so he engages with Indian philosophies and so on and so forth. Begins to meditate in Brazil. So the experience of the Holocaust is for Flusser apocalyptic, and the experience of Bodenlosigkeit, that is this loss of everything. The wonderful title of that novel, The Inheritance of Loss, you may recall, of having completely lost the ground beneath his feet, is an experience of history of humanity as we know it coming to an end. That is his text on history. Art creating images and understanding images denotes the possibility of an exit, a liberation from the history of compulsive linearity of the script and the written language. Becoming subject in the sense of Augustine again, or becoming human in the sense of Nietzsche, Menschwerdung, is for Flusser a project, subject as project, you know. And there is one other thinker that I don't have the time to talk about him, but he's someone I engage with very the sense of excitement and almost gratitude is Boris Groys, you know, who has taken the formalist discourse into the present day philosophy. And Boris Groys, he talks about a project of self-design. You know? So that is where I am. It is it's a story of a journey, as it were. You know, beginning with the teaching and learning of a foreign language, and then going through these turns, finding for yourself the meaning. Because why does one do this at all? It is because one can address the aporia, as you can see, the aporia, the unsolved puzzles, questions, gives you at least an opportunity, gives you a possibility of addressing these, and that's why it's so important to remain in this. I mean, and one grows slowly into these, and I wish the Department of Foreign Languages at Tezpur all the very best, and for its meaningful growth into the future. Let's hope that this pandemic comes to some sort of an end, and we have made adequate and fruitful use of the kind of solitude that we have been forced to accept, but we can turn into something which may help us to create and find a new meaning, and you know, that's where I am. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you, and thank you very much, Pallavi, for inviting me, Professor Jain, Professor Das. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for that very erudite talk, and it reflects your deep engagement with Western philosophy and Western philosophical traditions. Very interesting talk, and it also indicates an approach which I'm sure the people in our newly established department will reflect on. Now, I would like to invite questions, and there are two ways you can do this. You can unmute yourselves and ask, or you can put it in the chat box. So please, I think questions will be welcome. And since it was so, you know, there were so many things touched on I'm sure you have your queries and your observations, so please do ask. So Dengle is with us.
Professor Das, can I take a 1
Please,
minute, 2 minutes break?
Oh yes, absolutely, sir.
I'll be with you in 2 minutes. Thank you.
Sure, sure. Meantime, yeah, you can write your questions, or if you prefer to wait till he comes back.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Professor Dengle is back, and no one has written anything in the chat box. I think they prefer to engage with you directly. So please do.
Yeah. Hello.
This is Prashant Pandey, I think. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, sir. Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. It's always really nice listening to you. Would you please explain these three terms, liminoid, liminal experience, and liminality, please? Thanks.
Can you come again? I lost you in between.
Okay. Would you please explain these terms, liminoid, liminal experience, and liminality, what you mentioned during your lecture? Thank you.
Well, it's something which I think one has to perceive, as they say. Liminality is a neither nor kind of a scenario, a threshold person, as I tried to say. That it's becoming, it's letting go of that rigid compartmentalization which one is so used to, and between disciplines, for instance, between the subject and the object, and allowing these borders to become more and more porous in order that some sort of a free, I'm not sure the audio is clear.
So there is a question in the chat box. I think you're seeing it by Akash Joshi, and another question, Om Prakash.
In the chat box?
Yes, sir, in the chat box.
Where is my chat box?
Well, I can read it for you if you like.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, this is by Akash Joshi, and the question is, could you elaborate the difference between mytho, brackets, mythos, and Ricoeur's notion of metaphor? In the current political environment of post-truth and the inability to differentiate between journalism and propaganda of the establishment, a reflection on the difference would be helpful.
Whose question is this?
Akash Joshi.
Akshay Joshi.
Sir, my question.
Sorry.
Akshay
Yes,
Joshi.
Akshay. I'm sorry, I got the name wrong. Akshay Joshi. Yes.
Akshay, why do you want me to be political?
No, you could be philosophical, don't be political.
Just saying in jest, I know. But what is your question again? I mean, just elaborate it a little, Akshay. I know you.
No, because the shift was from the naturalistic notion of truth and reality, as in Wirklichkeit, not Wahrheit, but Wirklichkeit, to the world of semiotics, the metaphor, right? But there is another shift from reality, which is the material reality, to the notion of mythos or myth. That is also non-tangible, non-objective sphere. But it can't be the same as metaphor in the Paul Ricoeurian sense. Because, so in today's world of whatever, the political environment worldwide, where myths are being produced, where history is being reinterpreted, repaleted in a sense, or even reality is repaleted, and new myths are being created about past, about identity, about whatever legitimate existence. In that sense, your thoughts on the difference between metaphor and myth, which are both different from the naturalistic notion of reality, in that sense.
Akshay, it is my point, as I mean, within the framework that I have tried to embed my reflections on foreign language department and its growth. My point has always been a lack of methodological understanding. When it is always, as you know, Wilhelm Scherer, it is a kind of an inheritance. I mean, one inherits a kind of a discourse and methodology and critical reflection on the methods of understanding, of creating meaning, is part and parcel of the discourse of German studies. Do you agree?
Yes, sir. Yes, yeah.
Now, that is something when we are talking about establishing a department of foreign languages in India. That is the point that I'm trying to make. That awareness has to be there right from its inception, and then what you are talking about, will be an open-ended thing. I mean, you can't sort of decide at the beginning what the end would be. That would be completely un-Benjamin-like. No? I mean, it's something where you are saying that what I want to, I presuppose something which I've already proven for myself. That is not the correct understanding of metaphor or creation. See, I was talking about embracing the new, embracing the unknown. There is that openness. This is you've also read. We know, we are familiar with Popper as well. The enemies of open society, and something. See, the shift in the European context is from this sort of a professional philosophizing to a philosophizing which is called Lebensphilosophie, which is the philosophy of life. So the philosophizing begins with my experience. So you may have a perfect sense of order, and you ask me to accept it. I can accept it as a subject, as a discipline, perfect order, perfect system of philosophy beginning with logic, epistemology, metaphysics, aesthetics, theology, and so on. Perfect system. But it doesn't sort my problems out at all. In that inner reality, I continue to be discontented, and that was Nietzsche's problem, that my inner does not correspond with my outer. Is it possible to then inculcate in ourselves a kind of a methodological understanding whereby I become increasingly aware of my no-exit situation, as I was talking about with Sartre. So it's if I'm creating a new myth, with a sense to manipulate opinion, to influence opinion, then I'm in the same mode of knowledge is power. This sort of what I have tried to present to you has nothing to do with power, because it deconstructs this business of an obsession with power. It doesn't do that anymore. Does that answer your question in a sense?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
So there's another question here from
Yes.
Om Prakash, and I think you'll find this very interesting. First of all, he thanks you for your excellent talk. And then the question is, I was wondering if liminality can be used in the context of the role of a literary translation. Can the translator be seen as a liminal person negotiating between two literary traditions?
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, there is absolutely no, there are absolutely no two things about it. I mean, because you see, I'm sure Om Prakash, I mean, I know Om Prakash, so I mean, I'm sure he's referring to Benjamin's task of the translator. And I've tried to argue that the task of the translator presupposes the fulfillment of the task of the reader. The translator is the reader first, you know. So it is that reader has to actively participate in this process of creating meaning. It is only then that his translation, and then he is not bothered whether that translation is true to the original. And this kind of a stereotypical criterion of judging whether the translation is good or bad doesn't exist anymore. Now, this may have the danger of saying that, you know, whatever I have translated, you know, you accept it as the translator. That is not what you are talking about. Liminality, again, is, I mean, I heard an absolutely wonderful talk many years ago, which defined, which I've shared with some of you also. It defined enlightenment as a colon, Aufklärung als Doppelpunkt. You know, enlightenment as a colon. You know, the two dots. Enlightenment not with a full stop, but enlightenment as a colon. So the space between these two dots is, you know, is a process where it has to be kept alive. You know, that hin und zurück, that to and fro business, and that is something which liminal. So you see, you can't take your freedom of translation for granted. You have to go back to finding out whether your understanding of the text. Like, for instance, I mean, we have discussed it perhaps in another context where, you know, and that when you reach the end of a text in your process of reading, it's important to go back to the beginning. And it's so important that, you know, this guy, we're so embedded and so conditioned with this progressive linearity, as it were, which Benjamin criticizes, that we start with Kant's critique of pure reason and then go to a critique of judgment. And we don't do it the other way, whereas Schiller does it, and he shows it to you. Why, therefore, I mean, this is something which I find very meaningful, is that if you look at the history of the 18th century, Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment era, you find what Lessing writes is an Erziehung des Menschengeschlechts, on the education of mankind, and Schiller's project of aesthetic education. So there are these two poles, as it were. And then there is this wonderful quotation from Musil, Robert Musil, and something about, you know, he, in Man ohne Eigenschaften, man without qualities. You want your freedom, no? You want to go through the door, and you want that freedom. But you have to understand that that door has a frame. You know? And I think it's a very, very apt kind of a way of putting or situating and contextualizing the engagement of the reader, the translator, the interpreter, and the teacher of literary texts. Does that in some way, Om Prakash?
Yes, sir. Yes. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, I would like to request Omkar Joshi to ask his question directly. Can you ask Professor Dengle the question that you have put in the chat box directly.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you, sir, for your talk. It was nice to hear you after so long and also see you. I just had a small question. I'm coming to this from the perspective of foreign language teaching and not so much of academics. So, but I found the idea that you said that in order to get out of the everyday boredom of foreign language teaching, the aesthetics of everyday life is actually so I found that idea very interesting. And so, but I mean, my experience tells me that that is actually very difficult in practice,
It is.
because foreign language teaching has very particular and concrete practical goals. So I mean, and the courses have to be designed in order to achieve those goals, and so everything has to be in a time bound fashion and examinations and everything. So I mean, um, are there any specific methods you could suggest, or any texts you could suggest which can be used in foreign language teaching at lower levels also?
Well, Onkar, the thing is that, we have been very fortunate in JNU for the kind of liberal atmosphere that we have enjoyed thus far, where we can design our courses, use quote unquote texts and so on. I mean, I think Pallavi would recall that when she was in the third year, and normally we don't use complete literary texts when we were when you are dealing with a history of literature, but we did a novel and a complete novel, and I think it made a lot of sense. And there I was actually following what Harald Weinrich is saying, and I know, Onkar, that you have had this experience of teaching at the Goethe Institute and so on. I have also had the experience of being a learner there. And I saw that in those days, of course, the categories were different. It was M1, M2, and Oberstufe.
Yeah.
But beginning with M1, and I always faced flack from my teachers in Matsundar Bhavan for being too slow. They said, you have to be, etc. But that's a separate matter. They said it with whatever, lot of encouragement. They didn't want to sort of throttle me in any way or mug me in any way. But the use of literary texts, quote unquote, use of literary texts, See, you can use, the classic example is that of Brecht's poem When Haifische Menschen wären, And you can say that, I'm using this text in order to teach the conjunctive 2. You can say that, but you as a teacher have the inner liberal kind of a structure. You don't have to fit in this description. You can always deviate a little, talk about it a little, ask people to talk about what does Inhaltspeed GABA and so on and so forth at a very at the very beginning. I'm saying, and it does work. It's a question of how teaching I am, or how anxious I am to bring my class to an end.
Right.
I have to see the whole business of change and transformation is a spatial, and that is how it says that, if you identify the time, you're not going to change. So you have to tap that resource which is spatial in nature, SPTIAL, Räumlich, and then you can. So who's stopping you from being connected with the space, with the spatial, prior to the cogito? May the institution may say you have to finish your syllabus. Okay, I'm doing it, but at the same, no one is stopping you from encouraging your students in a way whereby they also get this opportunity to make that journey inward and touch upon that space prior to cogito. Sounds utopian, I know, very difficult, but no harm in trying. And I think there are some recipients who are extremely receptions dürftig and freudig, all who really want to sort of respond and not merely react. Depends, it goes both ways.
Yeah, yeah.
And you, Omkar, Omkar, I mean, I know your literary competence and so on and so forth. Who's stopping you from making it part of your language teaching? Yeah.
Well, as Faiz would say, और भी गम है ज़माने में.
Our
Anyway,
about it.
so
But our big गम है ज़माने में, उसके लिए और context है बात करने के लिए.
true. Yes.
Department and its growth.
Yeah, true.
So
Okay.
I think Jaya had a question.
Thank you.
So, Shruti Jain has been waiting for quite a while to ask you a
Oh,
question.
okay. Yeah. It's up to you. Yes.
Hello, can you ask Shruti Jain,
Yes,
please?
I'm really extremely sorry. I'm not so well versed with the Google Meets, and that's where I started typing. And the other thing is I'm writing on my phone, and that's where I just sent an incomplete message, which was, so I'm sorry for that. Well, I know what you're going to say, you know, I knowing you, but I want you to please also bring, address this point. Liminality is something that is so important. I mean, the threshold, we talk about threshold, a teacher being a threshold being. I would understand it as the threshold, that there is a lot of flexibility, that you're actually appealing to the teacher to have to expand oneself, right? This is something that I think that's the appeal that you're making through the concept of liminality, that expansion. Does that mean infinite flexibility? Does that mean infinite self-effacement? I want to know your stand on this. That is one question. Yeah, I have a certain opinion of myself. I know these are my goals. These are my Lernziele. Yeah, and yet I see the outer reality, and I want to connect it to the second question that I was trying to build on, that I go to a class where my students don't receive the knowledge that I want to give them, or at least, and I don't find takers for the knowledge. A very Zarathustrian dilemma. I don't find takers for the knowledge that I want to give. So then I see that there is low attendance, there is lack of commitment in learning, and I see there is lack of motivation. And this is not something that you face this at the JNU as well. So this is something that you have been facing right from the beginning. We've had many conversations regarding this. How should one deal with it? And how does the concept of liminality help me as a teacher? That would be my question to you.
Well, I succeed if I am conscious of this, and if I am convinced of what I'm saying, you know, then I succeed in maintaining some semblance of equanimity, some semblance of serenity, you know, and which also means that there is a greater degree of acceptance, you know, that it is going to be like this. There is no question about it. I don't today, Shruti, frankly, get too worked up about not being able to change the situation outside of myself. You know, today, for instance, in these virtual classes and so on and so forth, I can only have black boxes in front of me. I understand why students cannot have their videos on. There are very serious problems happening everywhere. My heart goes out to them. You know, that is not the thing. But people who have the possibility of having their videos on, of interacting with me, you know, refuse to do so. If I ask a question in the virtual classroom, I have to wait. I have to repeat the question thrice because the student has logged in and has disappeared.
Yes.
I don't see the student, you know. So ostensibly on my screen, I have 14 people. I see only 2 of them, and the rest, I don't know what they're doing. And what can I, sitting here, what can I do about it? Can I do anything? I can't. I have to accept this.
That's precisely what leads to self-doubt. And self-doubt, I mean, we're talking about Descartes, we're talking about, but this is an existential crisis that every German language, I mean, every language teacher, I speak to my Spanish and French colleagues too, denen geht es genauso wie mir. And I don't know, where are we lagging? I mean, do we need to address maybe other questions as well, as in the relevance, the relevance of learning languages, perhaps? Why is there lack of motivation? I am now out of that context of Goethe Institute, even JNU, yeah, and I am trying to work here at the JGU, and I actually have to fetch my own students. I don't teach literature, of course. I do only language courses. And yet, students, in spite of making things clear, everything doing methodologically correct, according to me, according to my training, I still feel there's a gap, and I'm not able to bridge that gap, There are students who are excellent, who sit there and they're so sincere, and that's why my classes are running, actually.
Yeah.
But then there are students who won't come, no matter what you try. What do you do there? And I'm sure there are other colleagues here and other my commilitone and have.
We are familiar with this. We lived with this situation that when you cross the threshold from bachelor to the masters,
Yes.
and you make a conscious decision. It's not something me who has sort of imposed it upon you. You make a conscious decision to do your Master of Arts in Literary Studies.
Yes.
And at the end of the 4th year, and that is at the end of your junior MA, if you're confronted with a question, have you read, for instance, Max Frisch's Andorra? There is no response. They have not read it. And this is something which I cannot possibly digest. But today, I know that it is going to be like that. Yeah, aise hi rahega. That there are some people who will read something, and the thing is, if students have read some other, I'm not insisting on Andorra, just an example. But if someone brings to the table the reading of a particular literary text, I walk that mile because I know I'm going to learn from it. I'm going to benefit from it. And I read that text and I talk about it in class. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and without any expectation of some sort of a return of sense of gratitude or whatever, nothing of the kind. But if someone is reading something else, I can include that something else in my oeuvre. Whereas something which is a canon of German studies, in German literary studies, even that canon is not followed. Then where do you go from there? It's just the state of affairs as it is. But I think the colleague that we had occasion to interact with using theatre, I think my colleague in Pune, Manjari, used it also. Theatre, I have benefited it from immensely from doing Hörspiele, radio plays, and theatre, and so on and so forth. We had an extraordinary teacher who would then read out stuff, who would spend that time with us to do to correct our intonation, diction, Pausierung, where you pause, and so on and so forth. And we did it. So there were the classes, whatever, 4 hours a day, and in the evening we would meet for rehearsals of these radio plays or theatre or whatever it is. And not ironically, but as luck may have it, I still remember the texts that I learned by heart in the 70s. I still know them by heart. So it is, and I'm not saying this as whatever self-profile, and that's not the point. The point is, it works both ways. The teacher has to simply keep offering possibilities and doorways, exits, and so on and so forth. Not everybody. I mean, we were a class of 14. How many people participated in theatrical activity? Maybe 4.
Maybe, yeah. Right.
Okay, so
Thank you so much.
So there is Milind Brahm, I think its name.
Milind
I forgot the name. Yeah, I forgot the name. Brahm from IITM, and he has a question. So may I ask him to ask you the question directly?
I will.
And then,
and how much time do we have now?
Maybe you can take one more question. That
Okay.
will probably be the last one after this. Jaya Khatri has been waiting for some time, so yeah.
Because I think Milind will have a.
Anyway,
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting lecture. My question is actually in continuation with Om Prakash's question about the translator and liminality. And it's also connects with what Shruti is trying to ask. So it's simply, can we say that liminality and an openness to ambivalence or ambiguity become in fact modes of praxis of foreign language learning and teaching? In the sense that what struck me in what Shruti was asking was liminality, I think, not as a concept, but liminality as a mode of being, as a mode of praxis. And in that sense, I think, Raju, when you replied that the teacher has to keep offering without probably thinking of the outcome, I think that is what it means to me, the openness to liminality and ambivalence. Thank you.
Now, I just want to say, Milind, that this business of liminality and I mean, for translators and students who are doing translation and so on and so forth, I always recommend that the foreword of the translator is so important. Om Prakash knows this. The thing is, and it's the same question. I mean, if it were to be a question only of knowledge, then one literary history, you could put a full stop, but you are not putting a full stop, you're putting a colon, right? You are saying that there is a need for a new look at the past, and that is that wonderful for the preface by Boyton and others, which I keep recommending to students. They should read it. Why is it important to let go of these old ideas where you have Aufklärung, enlightenment, storm and stress, and so on and so forth? That's kind of an epochal kind of a consciousness. Instead, you look at the 18th century as a unit with all its contradictions, which is a completely, and then while doing that, you're bringing in the other, as Boris Eichenbaum said, das Literarische and das Außerliterarische. You get these things together, the literary and the not so literary. You can bring these things, and then you find that the same literary texts that you had have a different meaning because they have been recontextualized. What I'm saying is, why is there this necessity to translate Proust as a challenge again and again and again? Now, it's a nightmare to translate Hertha Müller. But if you ask me whether I was completely content and satisfied with the translation, certainly not. I mean, there is a chapter, for instance, Meldekraut, and we translated it as Hajari Sag. I would like to redo that. This is the kind of, I read my translation, for instance, or I hear, it, and so you have translated a text, and if you put a full stop, then that's the end of discursivity. You translate a text and keep it open-ended, and if there are other things, then you find that you can be maybe part of a team which is going to translate Hertha Müller all over again into Hindi. And I would love to be a part of it, not as the main translator, but I would be, be definitely there to interact. That is how I think knowledge, becomes mobile in a positive sense of the term. Not putting an end to something, but keeping it alive. Does that?
Okay, and now I'd like to invite Jaya Khatri, and I think that'll be the last question. We can go on all day, but I think there's a need to bring it to an end also.
Yeah, okay. First of all, thank you so much, sir. It took me back to my old JNU days. Thank you so much for this presentation. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
Hello?
Can you introduce yourself?
Jaya.
Jaya. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for this presentation, sir. I have just one question. You said that as a foreign language teacher, we should allow the students to explore the subjectivity of the text and interpret it itself. But if supposedly I am introducing a literary text to a student who hasn't studied yet literature, and this is for the first time when that student is coming in like touch first time, it is his first time interaction with the literature, and there if I allow to interpret the text on its own and keep it open-ended, having no close-ended interpretation, it might create a problem for a
Then you
student to understand that.
as simple as that. I mean, the principle is that, there can never be a complete reading and reception of a text. So, I mean, I have always, maintained, like, for instance, when as children, we read, for instance, something like the Swiss Family Robinson, is my favorite example. And, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the film, and I said, my God, adventure and so on and so forth, I never looked upon Swiss Family Robinson as colonizing, a tribe on an island. I never did it. But when my son was small, and when I read out the story to him, he said, what are these guys doing? They go to an island, and instead of trying to live with the animals, they are just shooting them down for their own food. He said, I don't like it. A classic example, firsthand, of my experience.
Yeah.
So I actually was so grateful for the syllabus that my son had in the school, the kind of teaching that he was receiving in the school, where he, had that option, and it was there at home also. I mean, I never insisted that, no, this is the only reading of Swiss Family Robinson possible, So it was both ways. And so let it be, let your students then, they will grant that literary text its subjectivity the way it is absolutely correct at that point of time. You ask them to read the text a year later, and ask them to write an Inhals Vidagab and see what happens. Ask them to find out for themselves what happens. Store the first text in your memory, and then read it again after a year or so, whenever, and then compare the two readings to assess your own growth.
Yes, true. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, thank you. I'll now hand you over to the chairperson. Actually, Professor Jain, Vice Chancellor, is the chairperson for the session. So let me hand it over to him.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Das, for moderating.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Dengle, for enlightening us with very, very philosophical content as far as the teaching learning goes. And some of us who are not from the field of literature and language, I found it quite interesting. But the take home for me was that a teacher, apart from whatever he's delivering in terms of the contents of the syllabus or whatever, you mentioned that he has to learn to see the life around. And so that is something which is not necessarily applicable for the practitioners of the discipline of language and literature, but I think it holds true for all disciplines as far as the message which you wanted to give. And it also, in a way, makes you realize at the end of the day your true self. It makes you aware of what you are as an individual. And I would be sort of tempted to mention one little episode. I think you probably would recall that I was sitting in your office opposite you when you were Dean of Students. And I used to get perturbed many a times by a lot of things around me. because the students would create trouble. You know, the hostels were creating a lot of troubles for us. And then you gave me a plaque one fine morning, which said something like this: that God grant me the serenity to accept the things as they are, and to change the things I can, and give me the wisdom to see the difference. I still remember this, and I think it's so pertinent in response to the question which I think Shruti raised or someone raised, that the students are not attending the classes and they're not motivated. And so what is it that can be done? So I think your answer to that was, you know, you have to accept it, you know, with serenity. You know, you accept the things as they are. I mean, don't get sort of disturbed by the behavior or by the response or the reaction of the students in this case. Anyway, so this was quite a talk, sir, and I really feel so privileged to have listened to you. And thank you for enriching us. Hope to see you when things get normal. Hope to see you on the campus. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pallavi, also Dr. Das, you know, for this invite. I really enjoyed being with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Yeah, sir, I would like to now invite Rathiri Chakravarti, sir, to extend vote of thanks.
Okay.
Respected Professor Dengle, respected Professor Das, my esteemed colleagues, and all the participants, it is my privilege to have been thanks.
Sir, your voice is breaking.
I wish to express our gratitude to our head. Okay, maybe it's because of the network issue.
Please continue, sir.
Am I audible?
Your voice is breaking, sir. Your voice is breaking.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Yeah,
we are grateful to our honorable.
Complete the vote of thanks here.
Chancellor, sir. Yeah. Yes, sir. I wish to express our gratitude to our head, Professor Das, for his cooperation and guidance. I would express special thanks to our German language faculty, Mrs. Pallavi, for taking initiatives for the seminar. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation to Mr. Amarnath Sir for the technical support he extended during the session. Thanks to one and all. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and hope we will meet soon with another exciting session. And thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
All the best. It was great to see you all. Bye. All the best.
Bye, sir.